Hi everyone, welcome to the September 29th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last week's stakes racing, really focusing on the Breeders' Cup preps that took place at Santa Anita, a number of Grade 1 races, a lot of races for most of the Breeders' Cup divisions that help sort out some of these hierarchies, at least in California. The big race, obviously, was the Awesome Again there, featuring that matchup between Improbable and Maximum Security, though it didn't end up being much of a matchup. It was kind of a one-sided victory. We'll get to that in a little bit. We saw some races for the 2-year-olds, some turf preps for the Breeders' Cup Turf and Filly and Mare Turf, and then the Zenyatta on Sunday for the Breeders' Cup Distaff. We'll get to all of that. We'll also discuss a couple of races from Belmont Park, the Noble Damsel and the Vosburg, prep for the Breeders' Cup Sprint, and then we'll finish up by going to Churchill Downs and Delaware to discuss some notable speed figures and performances from those tracks. But Craig, let's begin with that Breeders' Cup Classic prep, the Awesome Again out in California. This was supposed to be the big showdown between Bob Baffert's two big guns, Improbable and Maximum Security. But I think the pace of this race had a lot to do with the result. And I mean, say what you will about Maximum Security and how fast he had to go up front, but at the end of the day, just one of these two horses showed up.
Yeah, it was an interesting race for sure. I was pretty surprised when Improbable dropped way back early, but obviously Drayden Van Dyke kind of knew what he was doing. As a fairly hot pace developed up front, we do have some of the fractions coded in red, and Improbable showed a different dimension of being able to just come from last, swoop the field, and run away from him at the end. It was a really good performance. He wound up with a 1:27 TimeformUS speed figure. I'll be the first to admit I was a bit surprised when I put the speed figures into the database and calculated them for all the horses. And Maximum Security actually got the same figure as the winner did, obviously mostly because of being part of that hot pace where he was up close to it early. So I don't think the effort from him is as bad as people are making him out to be. That like he's just done and ran a terrible race. I didn't see it that way at all. But looking at it and going forward, I think you have to make Improbable the Breeders' Cup Classic favorite at this point. If for no other reason that he's just running consistently good speed figures. And now we've seen some versatility from him. We've seen he can go wire to wire, and we've seen he can come from last and swoop around the field.
Yeah, it was kind of a weird race to watch because it was a 5-horse field where 4 horses basically went out for early position and 1 took back. We kind of talked about it on the forecast last week that it was going to be interesting to see how the jockeys rode this race because even Improbable seemed like one that could be relatively close to the pace. He had done that in the past, stalked the pace or been on the lead. And Drayden Van Dyke took that risk of allowing the others to go, and it certainly worked out for him. I think it also might have helped that he kept Improbable way out of the kickback on the backstretch. He didn't mind. I mean, you're not really losing ground when you go wide on a straightaway, but he kept him pretty far out outside of those horses and was able to swoop the field and win. Maximum Security, as you said, he got that high speed figure, 1:27, the same as Improbable. The pace obviously worked against the horses that were close to it up front. Still, though, despite the fact that they got the same TimeformUS speed figures adjusted for pace, I thought Improbable ran the much better race. Maximum Security, I mean, sure, those fast fractions worked against him, but I thought he was still supposed to separate himself from horses like Midcourt and take the 101. It's not like they really fell apart at the end. Maximum Security was just kind of fading along with them as Improbable drew away from the field. And I think the real story here is how fast they went in the mid portion of the race, because they went that third quarter in 23-2, and then after that, they just completely, the whole field fell apart. I mean, they went the last 3 furlongs in well over 39 seconds, and of course, Improbable was able to pull away through those slow closing fractions. I'm just not sure what to make of this race overall. Obviously, this was not the effort they were expecting from Maximum Security, and I guess Improbable is the leading contender for the Breeders' Cup Classic now. He's got 3 Grade 1 victories, and that's way more than anybody else. I just don't know if I really view him as a clear favorite for that race, because I think he's had some favorable circumstances in a few of his races. This race, including the Whitney last time, where he was right on top of a very slow pace. But you've got to give him credit where credit is due. He's just versatile enough to get the right trips in these races.
Yeah, that was my point with him. It's easy to say that he had really easy trips the last couple, and I wouldn't argue with that. But it's also pretty rare to find a horse that can have two distinctly different trips that he had and make them work. So he definitely has that going for him. And as far as maximum security goes, like I said earlier, I don't think he ran as bad as some people are saying, but I still do have my doubts that he's the same horse we saw in the Jason Service barn. As a horse that's approaching 5, he should be running speed figures that are as good or better than he did late in his 3-year-old year and overseas in Saudi, and we're just not seeing that from him. So I do think there is some regression from him.
Let's move on to a couple of the turf stakes races that we saw at Santa Anita on Saturday. Right before the Awesome Again, they ran the Grade 2 John Henry Turf Championship, and no surprise, United was 3-5 in this race, and you could tell it was basically over a few strides out of the gate when they let him get to a clear lead through pretty moderate to slow fractions, and they were just never catching this horse once they kicked for home.
No, for a minute there, I thought I was watching one of the Naira Turf Stakes, the way the pace had already developed in the Rodeo Drive that we're going to talk about. And in this one, I mean, United, he's a tactical horse. He's shown he can sit close to the lead, but I don't ever remember him actually being on the lead. But that was clearly a function of just how slow they were going. Once you do that, a 3-5 favorite who probably has a talent edge anyway, as you say, the race was basically over from that point. I do think Originaire ran pretty well to be second. He actually gets the same speed figure as United. They both got 123 on the TimeformUS scale. He showed he could stay a little bit closer when the pace was slower, but he's just not ever going to be able to outfinish a horse like United when he's got things his own way on the front end.
Yeah, I got to feel kind of bad for Originaire. I mean, I think this is now 4 races in a row where he's finished right behind United. He just can't seem to get past that horse, even though he comes pretty close. And he's not going to beat him when you get this kind of pace situation because Originaire is always at the mercy of pace. I mean, United is a horse that I think we've kind of knocked a little bit throughout the year for facing subpar fields, but now we're getting into the fall, and I think we have to take this horse pretty seriously as a Breeders' Cup Turf candidate, or leading contender rather, because it's kind of unclear how many Europeans are coming over, if we're going to get the typical European contention that we usually get for the Breeders' Cup. And I've got to say, the East Coast turf horses in this older turf division in the marathon races, it's not clear that they're really better than United at this point. So, I mean, United's going to have to show that he can take a show on the road and go outside of California, which is something he hasn't done. But he's got to be considered one of the favorites for the Breeders' Cup Turf.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's just not the strongest division we've seen in years past. We have a lot of horses that we keep seeing running over and over again, taking turns beating each other. And after all, this horse did get beat, what was it, a nose or a neck last year in the Breeders' Cup Turf. So the distance certainly isn't going to be a problem. Just the shipping question, as you mentioned, but he certainly fits with anyone else I've seen this year.
Now, I don't know if we can say the same thing about the fillies and mares we saw on the Rodeo Drive, as I'm pretty sure this California contingent of older fillies and mares on the turf does not really stack up to the horses we've seen on the East Coast. The speed figure will speak to that. Mucho Unusual, same situation as United. She just got to the front and nobody was able to catch her.
Yeah, it was the same thing. The race was basically over at the start. I mean, they were crawling up front. She wasn't pressured at all. She was clear pretty much every step of the way. And there was not really the kind of quality in this field that's going to be able to run down a horse like her, even when it only gets a 114 TimeformUS speed figure, which is, we have mentioned on the forecast. I think I said this was one of the weakest grade 1s I could ever remember seeing on paper, and that's how it played out on the track. It's just not a strong group. The top 3 all got 114 TimeformUS speed figures, and I don't really have a whole lot to say about this race. It should not be a grade 1.
No, certainly not with this field. I mean, the one horse that I guess you can point out that was compromised, obviously, was Lady Prancelot, who was trying to come from the back of the pack. She's just not going to be successful when she gets no pace ahead of her. That said, she's still doesn't really stack up with those East Coast turf horses from, the Chad Brown barn, the horses that we saw in races like the Diana. I just don't know if she's the kind that you really want moving forward, even though she was against it from a trip standpoint here. Let's get to the 2-year-olds. They ran a couple of preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile and Juvenile Fillies on Saturday at Santa Anita. We'll begin with the one for the Colts and Geldings, the American Pharaoh. And we've got a couple of horses that were making their dirt debuts in here, rounding out the exacta, both at decent prices. Get Her Number and Rombauer. Get Her Number stalked the moderate pace and just kept going. Rombauer made a big run from the back of the pack, but couldn't quite get by the winner. It was a weaker race coming in because the favorite obviously was a maiden. But both of these horses, they stepped up. I'm just not sure where they stand in the overall landscape of 2-year-olds in the country.
Yeah, from a speed figure perspective, they don't stand very high. Maybe if the race, the Breeders' Cup this year was going to be in California, I'd give them a little more credit, but it's not. They're going to have to ship to Keeneland and face better horses, so I'm just not very high on this group. The winner, Get Her Number, got a 103. The runner-up, Rombauer, a 101. This was one I mentioned on the forecast that the horses who had run on dirt were just a really uninspiring group. So it's not all that surprising that horses who had yet to run on the dirt were able to step up and beat the favored maiden in Spielberg. So not the strongest group, maybe a little bit better than what we're going to talk about next in the Chandelier, but I'm not really high on this one.
No, I mean, I will give Rombauer a little bit of credit for being the only horse to close in this race, and Mike Smith rode him a little conservatively late, almost like they're saving something for next time. I don't want to make too much of that, though, because I don't think he could have run a lot faster. I don't think he was ever going to win this race. And we'll see what we get from some of the other preps for the Breeders' Cup, because obviously we saw that very fast performance in the Hopeful at Saratoga. Remains to be seen if those horses can stretch out. This was the first really major route race that we saw around 2 turns for the 2-year-olds, so we'll see if the others can run faster than this. But I kind of tend to agree with you. We're likely to see faster performances at Keeneland and Belmont in the upcoming weeks. And the 2-year-old fillies in the Chandelier. Now, this is a tricky one because we've got a horse, the winner of this race, Princess Noor, who many are regarding as the clear standout favorite for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies based on her visually impressive victories in both the Del Mar Debutante and now this Chandelier. It just feels like this is an exceptionally weak group of 2-year-old fillies that she's beating in California.
Yeah, it does. Somehow I got involved. I didn't even participate, I don't think, but somebody tagged me in a thread on Twitter about, I guess this race got a really low buyer speed figure, something in the 70s. Well, it only got a 95 from me, so obviously I agree with whatever the buyer team came up with. And, you know, I mean, speed figures are reading the clock, and this horse just didn't run very fast, and she hasn't run particularly fast in any of her wins. That said, she's one of all the horses we saw. Maybe she can run faster. I'm not sure if she can or not. That's always a question when you deal with these 2-year-olds and even 3-year-olds as they try new things. But the way she's running now, she's a horse I would certainly be trying to beat in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies because I think I've seen better performances out there and certainly much better performances on the clock.
Yeah, I saw a lot of people kind of hating on the speed figures after this race and kind of questioning how a horse that was this impressive could have gotten a low speed figure, as if it was your judgment that caused the figure to be low, and it was just a measure against the other races that day. And you can speak to this, but it looked like the times were pretty straightforward in terms of comparisons from one race to the next. There were plenty of dirt routes at Santa Anita on Saturday, and her race just came back pretty slow. And I just posted on Twitter, kind of a ranking of all the top speed figures, TimeformUS speed figures for the 2-year-old fillies in the graded stakes so far this year. And there have been 7 of them. She's run the 4th and 5th highest numbers out of those 7 races. Other horses have just run faster. So, I mean, maybe she steps up when she meets tougher competition in the Breeders' Cup. But at this point, I agree with you. She's a bet against in that race.
Yeah, this was a race where I actually did the day. Normally my assistant does California. I did consult with him after to see if he agreed, and he said he would have done everything the same way. I actually could have given this race a lower figure. I kind of broke the mile dirt races out from the other races, the 2-year-old races and the Awesome Again. Those mile races do have a much longer run-up. Sometimes it has an effect, sometimes not. And I decided that it did on this day. Had I rated the mile races with the other ones, the figures would have been even lower. So I'm pretty confident in the call, and so far she just hasn't run very quick.
Okay, let's get to a race that we can be a little more positive about. On Sunday, they ran the Grade 2 Zenyatta, and I think a lot of people were expecting this to be the coronation for Fighting Mad, who had looked so good in her prior two victories at Santa Anita and the last time out at Del Mar in the Clement Hirsch, where she beat a very good field. All the top horses in California were in that race, and she won it. It was supposed to be a foregone conclusion that she was going to win her prep for the Breeders' Cup Distaff here, but I didn't see a big excuse for her as the 3-year-old filly Harvest Moon stepped up and beat her fair and square.
Yeah, we've talked about the 3-year-old fillies this year, that what a strong group it is, and you can add another one to the list. She had come in undefeated on dirt, won all 3 races, won them fairly easily, had improving speed figures, and she's going to improve her speed figure again. She got a 116 last time. My assistant is doing the Sunday. I don't have them officially yet, but I think it's going to be in the 119 to 120 range. So just a really good performance from her. I'll admit I watched this on a simulcast TV while I was at Remington for the Oklahoma Derby, but from what I could see, I didn't really see any excuses for Fighting Mad. She just didn't show up and run to those previous efforts. The pace was solid, but it wasn't anything that's going to be off the charts and give her a big boost on her overall number or anything. So good effort from the winner, disappointing from the favorite.
Yeah, Fighting Mad was one of these horses that had kind of gotten good out of nowhere because she hadn't really shown that kind of form early on. And I believe that she actually won the 2019 Torrey Pines for the 3-year-old fillies, which was the race that Harvest Moon had just won prior to taking this Zenyatta. And she obviously improved a lot out of that race last year. And boy, Harvest Moon took a big step forward here. This was by far the toughest test of her career, and she passed it. She really just pushed Fighting Mad into the ground, and Fighting Mad even faded to finish third in this race. It's Hard Not to Love, who came back with a much better effort than we saw out of her at Del Mar last time, got up for second, though she was never really in any danger of winning this race. And like you said, these 3-year-old fillies turning out to be a really strong crop. Many of them have been running TimeformUS speed figures right around that 120 mark, and I think it's going to be a really interesting Breeders' Cup Distaff because we've got a number of 3-year-olds that seem like they can really compete against these older horses.
Yeah, I will mention one thing with Fighting Mad. I'm not a huge weight guy, but she did have to carry 126 in this field. I assume it was a weight for age thing. I'm not sure what the conditions were exactly, but she was spotting the winner 8 pounds, which if you are a weight person, that is a pretty big gap.
Later in the day on Sunday at Santa Anita, they ran the Grade 2 Santa Anita Sprint Championship. Supposed to be basically a 3-horse race among CZ Rocket, Collusion Illusion, and Flagstaff. But given the way the pace played out, it was really down to just CZ Rocket and Flagstaff who were up close to the front. And CZ Rocket was able to wear down his rival. This horse just has a nose for the wire. He's now won all 5 starts since being claimed by Peter Miller. Not running the fastest figures, but he just keeps getting the job done.
He does. He's another one I saw a lot of talk about him, and people are wondering how Peter Miller has turned him around and made him into this great sprinter. But frankly, I don't see it. He's decent enough, but he's just beating up on horses that aren't that good, really. He just keeps... It's not like he's running off the chart speed figures that he had never run before, because he has run these speed figures before in other barns. Now, he does seem to have gotten back to his best form, which he had tailed off a little bit before the claim, but... I just don't know what to make of these sprinters. We've talked about them in California a lot, and we're going to talk about some in New York later. There's just not a real quality like we saw last year when we had Matoli and some other really good horses out there. For a Grade 2 and Grade 1 type horses to only get what's going to be, I would guess this one will get in the high teens, maybe with a pace adjustment because the pace was so slow for a race like this. I just don't know what to make of them at this point, but I'm not very high on this group at all. It seems like we've been talking about Flagstaff forever, and he's always a good guide. He's a horse who just hasn't been winning much lately, but he always runs the same figure, so it's hard for me to take these horses seriously as Breeders' Cup Sprint types.
Yeah, I'm really on the same page as you about CZ Rocket. I was just scrolling back through his past performances in the TimeformUS charts, and he's actually run TimeformUS speed figures of 120 or higher 4 times in his career. None of those were for Peter Miller. They were all prior to the claim. So I agree with you. He's just gotten him back to some of his best form. Maybe not even that. He's just catching the right fields. What I will say is it seems like he has more tactical speed since being claimed by this barn, and that's helped him in a lot of these paceless races that we've seen out in California, especially here where they didn't go that fast up front and he was right on top of it and able to wear down Flagstaff. I don't want to be too hard on this race because we'll get to another prep for the Breeders' Cup Sprint later on that didn't come back a whole lot faster than this, and it just seems like the Breeders' Cup Sprint division is not that strong this year, especially missing Volatile, and I don't know where Vacoma is or where they're even going to run him when he comes back, but it's just not the strongest group of horses, so I don't want to be too hard on these guys, but they're not running the typical speed figures that we'd expect from the leaders of this division. One more race to discuss from California. It actually took place earlier on Friday. That was the Grade 2 Eddie D going 5.5 furlongs on the turf, prep for the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. And Big Reneur, pretty lightly raced 5-year-old, came back off the layoff and just dominated this race on the front end.
Yeah, this was a good effort. I will mention again my standard disclaimer for these turf races out in California. Nothing's changed in those 5.5 furlong races. I timed them all from video because Trackish just can't seem to get them right. So the figure was made from a really good time, an accurate time, and he wound up with a 124 TimeformUS speed figure. He was clear all the way around, but I mean, that's how he does his best running. He has come from off the pace to win in the past, but his last couple have just been front running wire-to-wire scores, and this horse seems like a dangerous one for me for the Breeders' Cup Sprint coming up at Keeneland if they wind up there, because he's got that high speed and he's running speed figures that could put him right there in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I think you always have to worry about form for these horses and how they're coming into these races, especially in the turf sprints, especially for a horse like this that's so lightly raced and has obviously had some physical issues that kept his number of starts down to this point in his career. But he looks to be coming into that Breeders' Cup in top form if they choose to go there. Wildman Jack, who was second, he's the horse that we've talked about in the past, running some high speed figures in these races. He ran a big time form number in Dubai over the winter, came back with a good performance at Santa Anita. Didn't run so well at Keeneland. Seems like he's lost some of the early speed that he once possessed, and that worked against him a little bit in this race. But I thought he ran pretty well to be second, just caught a top performance by the winner of this race. Let's move over to the East Coast to Belmont Park, where they ran a couple of graded stakes on Saturday. We'll begin on the turf with the Grade 3 Noble Damsel. This one was going a mile on the Widener turf course, and the pace of this race, I know you made a crack earlier in the show about there being slow paces at Naira. That was not the case in this race, as Blowout, who does have a lot of natural speed, John Velasquez just let her run off in the early stages, and she really strung out the field down the backstretch. Sweet By and By tried to make a middle move after her around the far turn, but she never got past Blowout, and it wasn't until the late stages that her stablemate Valladera, who got a great ride from Joao Rosario, was able to run her down.
Yeah, this was definitely not one of the races I was talking about when I made that crack. Blowout was absolutely flying on the front end. I saw some people questioning the time, but really I didn't time this one. I didn't see any reason to. Looking at the Trackus numbers, it seemed to basically agree with it. So I don't doubt that the time was fine, and Blowout just put in a big effort. Actually got the best figure in the race as the runner-up with a 120 off her 117 final time, but this was a race that, in my opinion, was won largely because of the ride of Joao Rosario. He saved a lot of ground, made his move at the right time, and was just able to wear her down very late in the going. And good effort. I thought all three of the top three ran well given the pace. I wouldn't go much further than that, but solid horses, and it was probably about what it was. A grade 3 rating is about the quality, but maybe even a grade 2. As I said, I thought for these two, especially coming out of an allowance race, the 2-3 finishers, they ran very well in here.
Yeah, I thought this was a pretty strong race for the level, and I mean, Valladera got the money here, and I think that that's greatly owed to Joel Rosario, who saved every bit of ground, didn't panic when he encountered some traffic at the top of the stretch, as he never does. He always takes that shot, and it worked out for him here as he was able to find a seam and get through, and she took him there to get to the wire first. But yeah, the real story of this race is the amazing performance that Blowout put forth, setting that crazy pace and holding on. And it's kind of funny. I think a lot of these riders in New York are so used to the races featuring slow paces that I wonder if the clocks in their heads were a little off here. And you saw a lot of them kind of riding, even the closers, to stay in the race early, whereas the horses probably would have been more comfortable dropping 10 or 15 lengths off the pace. And I think Blowout just took everybody out of the race, because I saw some people questioning the times of this race and the fractions afterwards, probably because nobody closed except for Valladera. The others just kind of ran in place. But I think that's because all of the closers were taken out of their game. I mean, just look at the pace line for a horse like Feel Glorious. She was running pace figures early in the race that she's likely never seen before, because she's used to being in slower paced races. And I think that just sapped the late kick of a lot of these horses.
Yeah, that's a good point you make. We saw a similar race, not running exactly the same way as the opener on Sunday at Belmont, where a maiden horse ran off, opened a big lead, was going really fast. And I agree with you. I think it kind of throws the riders. They're not used to it. We saw another race there where the closers probably tried to get into the race a little sooner, and the horse who wound up being the closest to the runoff leader was able to hold them all off to win. So it's an interesting perspective, and you really got to look at these races. You don't know if you'll see this kind again, but it's a trip they're not used to, so it's something you want to consider when you handicap these horses going forward.
And I will mention, we're likely to see most of these horses coming back in the Matriarch later in the year. I don't think this is really the kind of race that's going to produce Breeders' Cup starters, but I think all of these fillies would be a good fit for the Grade 1 Matriarch in California in December. We saw a Breeders' Cup prep in the next race at Belmont, the Grade 2 Vosburg, prep for the Breeders' Cup Sprint, and Firenze Fire got the job done. I kind of agree with your assessment. You've kind of been saying this for a while, that this isn't the same Firenze Fire that we saw for the Jason Service Barn, but he just didn't really have to be to win this race. His main rivals just didn't really step forward here.
No, Stan the Man scratch kind of took a lot of speed, or potential speed, out of the race, and yeah, it's just not the greatest effort we're going to see for what's, I guess this is a Grade 2 now, but it's still a main Breeders' Cup Sprint. We didn't get a lot of pace in here. Share the Ride, who's kind of a cheaper horse, who has run some decent figures, but nothing that would expect you to think he could win a race like this, was allowed to lope on with Firenze Fire sitting just off of him, and he was able to kick home and win with a 118 final. It's TimeformUS speed figure. The final time was 122, so it was knocked down 4 points for the pace. But again, much like the race in California, that Santa Anita Sprint Championship, not one I'm going to get all that excited about, but as you mentioned, I don't know who the main sprint contenders are right now. Vekoma seems to be in hiding. I haven't looked to see if he's even working out right now. Last I checked, he hadn't been. So I don't know who it would be. And I'm actually interested to see if any of the fillies and mares will give a shot in this one, as opposed to the 7 furlong filly and mare sprint, because it looks like it's ripe for the picking to me.
No, I mean, the one horse that maybe is our hope to step forward and dominate this sprint race among the colts is maybe that 3-year-old Yopon, who I know was running at Pimlico, I believe, on Thursday, and the Chick Lang. He ran a fast race last time out in the Amsterdam and Saratoga, and certainly fast enough to suggest that he could be a player against these current crop of older horses that we see in the sprint division. But I'm on the same page as you. I mean, Serengeti Empress, I know she hasn't gone as short as 6 furlongs in a very long time, but she certainly has the speed to do it, and given the slow paces we see in so many of these preps for the Breeders' Cup Sprint, that could be the right race for her. Tom Amoss might want to consider that. I mean, I'm sure, you don't have to give him the hint. I'm sure that they're considering all of the options, but that might be a savvy move for her connections.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rare day that we say the filly and mare sprint might be the stronger race, but with horses like Gamine coming in, and we've just seen a lot of big efforts in that division in the 7 furlongs, it just seems like a much stronger race to me than the sprint's going to be.
And speaking of those Breeders' Cup preps, we saw a prep for the Dirt Mile on Saturday at Churchill Downs. That was the Grade 3 ACAC, and it was a bit of a resurrection of Mr. Money, who was a very good 3-year-old last year, won a number of those Midwest derbies throughout the summer and fall before obviously not running well in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile of 2019. But earlier this year, he just looked like a completely different horse. His form just had totally fallen apart. Got back on track here with a good ride coming up the rail by Gabriel Saez, as this race just totally fell apart behind him.
Yeah, this race was kind of ugly from a visual standpoint. It was just a huge line across the track. Mr. Money got the best trip. He got a 1:18 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, so almost back to where he was last year. Like I said, I've been disappointed in him this year. I thought he was a horse who, sticking around for his 4-year-old year, would make a big move forward, and he hasn't done that yet. But at least he's moving in the right direction with this effort, because earlier, I'm not even sure where this one came from. His last race may have been his worst one all year, but this was a solid enough effort. It was a big gap back to second on the figures. Runner-up Bourbon Calling only got a 1:12, so not the strongest race, but not going to totally write off the winner, Mr. Money, as he has run faster in the past, and maybe he's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I was a little surprised to see him even as low as 6-1 in this race off his recent performances, because, as you said, they were just terrible. And his last race was a complete non-effort. But obviously, something pointed to him getting back in the right direction here, because he obviously won this race as much the best horse, because he was pretty close to that early pace that came apart. And Warrior's Charge, who was setting that pace, faded very badly in the stretch. He was the big disappointment of this race. I don't know if you really want horses coming out of this race for the dirt mile. I think there'll be some stronger preps. There were other horses pointing for that race that look like they're maybe a cut above these, but we'll see how it comes together on Breeders' Cup Day. Before we move away from Churchill Downs, just want to touch on one other race that they ran there earlier in the week. That was an allowance race on Thursday on the turf going a mile, and Segoy, who's actually just a 3-year-old, beat a group of older horses and did so with a pretty impressive TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, he did. When you sent the rundown, I was like, who in the world is Segoy? I honestly didn't remember who it was. I mean, I knew the race got a pretty good figure, but I didn't look that deep into it. But now that once I realized he was a 3-year-old, I could see why you picked it. Stepped up, beat older horses with a really nice 121, a figure we haven't seen from 3-year-olds winning stakes races this year for the most part. So big effort from him. He's kind of been a hard horse to get a handle on. He's run some big numbers, but he's been really inconsistent. He was part of that Grade 2 American, just crazy fast pace, and he definitely had an excuse to kind of pack it in there. But I thought this was a really impressive effort, and he looks like he's ready to jump right back in the stakes company. He is a horse who looks like he needs things to go his own way. I shouldn't say he doesn't have to have it go exactly his way, but he's definitely got to be up front. He's a horse who is going to run his best races on the lead, and in this case, he did so in a race with plenty of red fractions and was able to fight off the competition and was actually pulling away at the end.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's a horse that really is at the mercy of how these races develop, because he needs to be in front or contesting the pace to really have any shot. And he wasn't on the lead every step of the way, but he was contesting the pace with another horse who was a little inferior to him, but they drew well clear of the others down the backstretch. And the others, I mean, kind of like in that Noble Damsel, there were closers in this race that just got badly outrun in the early stages, and they tried to make up ground, but they just had too much ground to make up in the stretch. The one caveat to this performance that I'll give is it was a good rated turf course. I would say with probably closer to yielding, because you see that TimeformUS course rating, it was a 5 out of 10. That really speaks to a course that's a little closer to the yielding side. And at Churchill Downs, when the turf course gets very wet, we do often see a situation where it can be tough to close from the back of the pack. So maybe that helps Segoy a little bit. And this race was dominated by long shots. A big favorite entry was out of the money. So maybe you want to take this result with a grain of salt. But this horse does have some talent when things go his way. We're going to close things out with one more venue that we rarely visit, that being Delaware Park. They ran a bunch of races on Saturday for horses that had previously raced at Delaware Park throughout the meeting. And one of those stakes was the Governor's Day Handicap. Pretty short field, but a special performance from the winner, Fact Finding, who just seems like he's completely turned his life around since this trainer switched to Reeve McGahee.
Yeah, I actually, this was one where when I made the figure for it, I kind of get flags if certain races get figures that look a little too high, and this one popped up. He got a 125 for the win, but when I went back and looked at the card, I mean, it was completely legitimate. He ran off one by a bunch. I think it was like 11 lengths or something like that. Just destroyed the field in a race where he wasn't even the favorite. He certainly seems to have found a new life. I will give the caveat that it was a sloppy track. A lot of times we see these runoff kind of wins. We have it noted in red as a track that was highly speed favoring. So I'd want to see him do it again under better circumstances or more fair circumstances to the rest of the field. But that said, he did run a 119 Timeform US speed figure in his win the prior time out. So he's certainly a horse who seems to be moving in the right direction since that trainer switch. And, you know, who knows, running a 125, that's a serious speed figure. I'd like to see him put in with some better company.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a situation where that increase in speed figure was largely due to circumstances, as speed figure improvements often are with these older horses. As you said, the speed favoring track and the fact that it was sloppy, and his main rival, Wait For It, who was the slight favorite in this race, you could argue maybe he's not at his best over a very wet track. He's run lower speed figures on wet tracks in the past, so I guess fact finding had the advantage in that sense. But this is a horse who's always shown ability. I mean, I remember back when he was a 3-year-old in Todd Pletcher's barn, there were briefly some hopes that he could make the Kentucky Derby. He was actually, I think, second choice in the Sam F. Davis back in 2017. Things went awry for him. He cycled through a few different barns, but seems like he's back in top form now as a 6-year-old gelding, and it'll be interesting to see if they try a tougher spot next time, which I assume they'll do, whether he can reproduce this kind of performance.
Yeah, I have to assume it was Hamilton fans that made Wait For It the favorite. That's the only thing I could figure out here.
Well, that's all the racing to recap this week. Obviously, we've got a big weekend coming up with the Preakness taking place on Saturday, the final leg of this unusual Triple Crown of 2020. And Craig and I, we're not as busy as we usually are maybe for one of these weeks, so we're going to do a full show, probably recorded on Thursday, handicapping some of those Preakness Day Stakes races, so look for that. Obviously, the Preakness has drawn a pretty interesting field with Kentucky Derby winner Authentic coming back and Art Collector, the likely second choice, who missed that race. She'll be a good matchup. We'll discuss that and everything else when we do the TimeformUS forecast on Thursday. Remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and look out for that TimeformUS forecast later in the week.